Last year, the Chaos Dwarves made their long-awaited return to Warhammer as the Helmsmiths of Hashut. These new models definitely had a lot of good things going for them, but I felt they lacked a lot of the stylistic features that had really made the classic Chaos Dwarves what they were. I had heard that there was supposed to be a different Chaos Dwarf refresh around 8th edition Fantasy, which from what we saw of it seemed like it was going to be much more my style. So today, inspired by that, I'm going to try and make Chaos Dwarves my way. Before we get started, I just wanted to quickly say thank you all so much for 2,000 subscribers. It really does mean a lot, so yeah, thanks guys. Anyway, one of the features I really liked about the old Chaos Dwarves were the sort of Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian style they had going on. In some places, it was pretty overt that this was the inspiration, like the Lamassu units, and yet a lot of these visual styles were just almost entirely absent from the Helmsmiths of Hashut, bar this sort of cuneiform inspired writing they had going on, and I think these styles look really cool, so it's definitely something I'm going to lean into quite a lot more with my version. Though it's not quite Chaos Dwarf related, you might also be interested to hear that the Mesopotamian god of disease was called Nergal, or Nergal, however you want to say it, but I'm pretty sure this must have been the name inspiration for Nergal. I mean, it's a mad coincidence if not, but I suppose it is always possible. The Assyrians are going to be my main source of inspiration for this build, and fortunately, some Assyrian rulers commissioned a vast quantity of wall reliefs for their palaces, which give us some really cool stylistic elements to work with. I went to go and try and see these in person, but most of the galleries were shut when I got there, so we're going to deal with this book for the most part, but you will see a couple of real pictures. Looking through this, there are a couple features that I do particularly like. The first one is this big tower shield. The second is this sort of pointed helmet, which I did actually manage to see in person, and here's a real one, it's not just a relief. This sort of horned headdress style, and also this classic Assyrian king crown. My guys are also going to need to be armed with something, and for this I'm going to take inspiration from the original Chaos Dwarves with this semicircle axe style, which was actually used by several of Assyria's neighbouring states. This particular one is actually an ancient Egyptian axe, though of course it has been polished, it didn't come out of the ground this clean. Alright, so now I've got a rough sense of the stuff I want to include, I'm just going to make a start. I'm only going to make 3 of these guys, 2 normal infantry dudes and 1 guy who can be either a unit leader or commander or something. I'm going to be using the Dwarf Hammerer's kit as the basis for this conversion, and I assembled the bodies for those guys more or less as normal. But the chest plate and arms of these guys had a little too much Norse-style dwarfy detail on them, so I began carving most of it away. On the torso, it was this overlapping plate, and on the arms I cut away most of the upper forearm detail, but some of them had these little gems on the wrists that I thought looked pretty in keeping with the new style, so I left those. These cuts did make the chest plate look a little bare and funny looking, but don't worry, we're going to come back to that. Next I was going to deal with the weapons. The axes in the kits weren't very close to the style of axe I was going for, so I needed to make a new blade for them. I chose plasticard for this. I marked out a rough outline of 2 small semicircles, back to back, with a pencil, before cutting them both out as one disc and sanding the curve smooth. After this I drilled 2 holes along the centre line of the disc to form those 2 little semicircle cutouts, after which I could separate the 2 halves and sharpen the edge with my knife. This all sounds quite straightforward, but it did take me a couple of goes to get right. I then repeated the same steps, but with 1 larger blade which I was going to give to the commander, after which I could just cut off the old axe blades and stick on the new ones. I wondered a bit about the overhanging top contact point, and considered adding a sort of spike on the top of the haft to fill out the space, but I actually think I quite like how this looks, and so I'm going to stick with it. The larger blade would be for a 2-handed axe, but the regular soldiers with the smaller axes would also have a shield. I was going to use plasticard for this, and take some heavy inspiration from those tower shields we saw earlier. But I wanted to make it a little more angular, for 2 main reasons. First, because I thought it would better fit with the sort of heavy, almost industrial Chorv style, and the second is because I thought it would be a lot easier to make. After I had drawn and cut out the 2 halves of the shield from plasticard, I scraped the edges smooth and then scraped an angle down the middle, so that when they were glued together they would sit at a roughly 100-degree angle. I then cut out the shield shape on a thinner piece of plasticard, and cut out the central section to form the trim of the shield, after which the shield could be assembled and smoothed out. The last modification I needed to make to these guys before I started doing some sculpting was on the heads. Possibly the most important Chaos Dwarf feature is their beards, which are made up of these big dark ringlets and don't look much like the beards these guys have at the moment. So they were going to have to be cut off, which will probably get me landed in the Book of Grudges, but don't worry, they will be getting new ones soon. The helmets received the same denorsing treatment as the rest of the body had. the only extra step being on the helmet of the commander, where I gently tapered it inwards to prepare for our next step, which was going to be the sculpting. The first thing I wanted to deal with was the weird shape of chestplate I'd been left with. One of the features of the new Dwarves that I really liked were their sashes, so I decided to incorporate sashes onto my guys too, which would nicely conceal this weird looking area. I did this by rolling out a sausage of greenstuff and miliputt mixed roughly 50-50 and pressing it down around the shoulder and diagonally across the body. After the general shape had been marked out, I came with some sculpting tools. I just used these metal fellas, which I think might be originally dentist tools. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm genuinely not sure, and this silicone sculpting tool, both of which I used to create these wrinkled folds in the fabric. The next area I dealt with were the helmets, and we'll be coming back to these a few times over the project, but this was when I had to decide on which style of helmet I would give them. I'd initially thought about basing my helmet on this style of Assyrian helmet, but I was worried that they'd look a little bit too much like party hats. So I tried to go for this style, with the intention of replacing the plumes with plasticard arrows for that chaos spiky goodness, but in the end, that was too hard to sculpt, so I went with the initial design. I actually forgot to record what I did to the commander's helmet, but don't worry, we'll talk about it a bit more later on. I also sculpted the shield bosses at this time, which was pretty simple, and then I could finally move on to the main event, the beards. These were actually also pretty straightforward. All I did was roll out a couple of worms of my greenstuff and miliputt mix, cut them into short lengths, and then add these little grooves to denote ringlets with my sculpting tool. All I needed to do then was layer this enough times that it actually ended up looking beard-like. After giving this all a day or so to cure, I could come back and start refining things. I began with some sanding, which particularly helped me to get the helmet shapes right, and also to cover up a lot of the fingerprint marks that I'd left pretty much all over the place. I then rolled out some green stuff, without any miliputt this time, to add some finer details. The first area I was going to do this to was on the commander's helmet, for which I was going to do a sort of fusion between the Assyrian king's crown, which could sometimes be absolutely huge by the way, and one of these horned headdresses used by divine beings. My first green stuff detail was going to be some of those layered horns. These were made quite simply by rolling out a tapering sausage and sticking it in place, after which I just poked it around with my sculpting tool until it looked about right, which I then repeated 3 more times. And I do think it came out pretty awesome. I then added a band of trim around underneath the horns, and will eventually do the same for the other helmets, which is also somewhat historically inspired if we're going for that angle, but if I'm being honest, I just thought it was because they looked a little bit flat without it. This is also when I gave the leader that little cone on top of his head, which I do think looks absolutely rubbish at the moment, but don't worry, I do shave it down later, and I think it just about ends up working. This was all I had actually planned to do on the heads of these guys, but they really weren't looking chaosy enough yet, so I decided to add some more normal chaos style horns to both the commander and the regular dudes. I also accidentally replicated the look of bloodletter horns, which I think goes really well with the tall pointed helmet to create a sort of pseudo bloodletter look, which I think works quite nicely to subtly tie them into the wider chaos universe. I do think these guys still need a little bit more specifically Chaos Dwarf detail on them though. So I cut out a number of small lightning bolts and arrows and added these in a couple of focal areas. I added an arrow to the helmets of the regular dudes, 2 lightning bolts and an arrow to the double-handed axe, and an arrow to each of these smaller axes, all of which I made out of a thin sheet of plasticard, and I think they came out pretty great. But adding all this detail everywhere else was making the shields look a little flat, so I added some small green stuff rivets to the trim to help break up that surface a bit. The final part of the build for these guys was to add the classic stuck out bottom lip with protruding tusks all good Dwarfs need. This is probably one of those points when it's best not to think about how this works anatomically, because it won't make much sense, but all I needed to worry about was that it looked cool, and I think it's really one of the features that does sell these guys as Chaos Dwarves. The only things left to do now were stick the arms on, add these little shoulder pads on the leader, and with that, they were finally done. I did leave the shield arms detached for ease of painting, but you can pretty much see how everything's going to look. Throughout the process, when I had spare green stuff, I'd use it to make little rocks for the bases, so if you're wondering where all that came from, that was just something kind of spontaneous and unplanned I did when I had spares. Obviously, a hardcore Dwarf fan isn't going to be satisfied with the hat size on these guys, but overall, they do kind of fit the slightly more realistic, but still Chaos Dwarf style I was hoping for. Honestly, I am pretty proud of these guys. The horns on the commander are definitely too long, but this project represents quite a step forward in my sculpting, and I really dig the results, so it's a win for me. The next big step to tackle was that I just didn't know how I wanted to paint these guys. I'd added and changed enough so they didn't really fit a classic box art image style, so to figure out what colour I wanted everything to be, I spent some time with some mocked up images to figure out roughly what I wanted where. One of my biggest mental hurdles in this was that painting them red and gold I felt would make them look far too warm. I wanted a darker, old brassy style look and a red that wasn't too in your face. But I didn't want to make them look super weathered because I imagined that Chaos Dwarves would actually take quite good care of their weapons, since they care so much about machines and that. So the solution that I came to was a version of something I've seen Murray do on Tabletop Time. What he does is cover the whole model in a couple of different colours from different angles to create a nice varied colour depth. But this wasn't quite the look I was going for. I didn't quite want to do exactly that, but I did want to borrow parts of this to create deep, complex mottled colour, and also hopefully to bring in that coolness in some of the deeper recesses. I started out on the bronze areas, which I painted in with Rhinox hide to provide the basic brownness, after which I picked a dark, desaturated blue and green. In this case, Wargflesh and Stegodon scale green. And then, once I'd thinned them down a bit, roughly and unevenly stippled this on. After this, it was time to add the actual metal colour. I sponged on some Warp Block bronze, making sure to let a good amount of that undercolour shine through, after which I did the same thing with Balthazar gold, but being a bit lighter in my application and focusing more on upturned surfaces. After which I gave it a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and then rapidly decided I didn't like it. So instead I used Nuln Oil over the top, which brought down the warmth a bit. To take that down further, I added uneven patches of Beltan Green and Drakenhof Nightshade, which brought back that nice old complex bronze look and is going to work quite well with our green-blue undertones. Once that had dried, I gave these areas a dry brush with Balthazar Gold, and then with the aptly named Hashut Copper, which I also used as a layer for the areas I wanted to be gold like the Commander's Horns. I really liked how this came out, so I wanted to do something similar for the silver details. This time I based the areas in Mechanicus Standard Grey, after which I covered it with Nuln Oil and more splotches of Drakenhof Nightshade, for a more subtle version of what I did earlier. I then stippled on some Iron Warriors, trying to keep a good amount of that colour showing through, but I didn't do a particularly good job, so I did end up applying more Nuln Oil and Drakenhof Nightshade over the top. These areas were then finished with a highlight of Stormhost Silver and a couple of scratches on the axe blades. I wanted to do something similar but a little bit more subtle for the red. I began with Xeris Purple and stippled on some Stegodon Scale Green, which I hope is going to come together to make a really nice, deep, interesting shadow colour that still brings through a little bit of that coldness in the red that I'm going for. With all of this set up, I could now start adding the actual red, which I did with a thin coat of Corn Red, which was then highlighted with Evil Sunz Scarlet, which I also used to add some scratches to the shield. To be honest, I probably could have skipped the purple and blue sections for the red. It did come out looking pretty normal, but maybe it does actually make a difference. I'm not sure I can tell. The rest of the painting process wasn't actually particularly interesting, and since I'd been finding it really tricky to film some of the detail work and had run into a bunch of problems painting the skin, I just decided to stop recording and not include a painting segment this time. Which means that you guys get to skip all the tricky bits and go straight on to see how it all turned out. The inspiration for this video came when, about 4 months ago, the YouTuber Anvil of Doom made a video painting a Games Day mini from the era of the Chorf refresh that didn't quite happen. I really like the style of that mini, and I do think I've made these guys in such a way that they could kind of look at home next to that model. I enjoyed this, honestly, way more than I was expecting to. I mean, I still expected to have a good time, but I really enjoyed this approach to making models. So, if you guys would like to see more of this army, which yes, is how I'm going to refer to these 3 dudes, then let me know. I'd definitely be looking for some other ideas of units to make in this style. And in other news, I've finally invested in one of those turny-roundy thingies that all of the other Warhammer YouTubers seem to have, which is now providing the nice ending shots that you're currently looking at. Anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and once again, thank you so much for 2,000 subscribers. It really is pretty awesome. Don't worry, there won't be such a long wait for the next video, I promise, and I will see you all again very soon with something a little bit more inquisitorial. Bye for now.